The radio chatter was routine until it wasn't. 17 minutes into what should have been a standard convoy escort through the Korangal Valley, the lead Humvee reported movement on the ridgeline. Then the world exploded. The ambush was textbook overlapping fields of fire, pre-positioned heavy weapons, escape routes blocked by rock slides that appeared too convenient to be natural. Intelligence had called this route clear. Intelligence had been catastrophically wrong. The convoy commander, Captain Marcus Webb, had 11 vehicles, 43 personnel, and exactly 0 air support within a 20-minute response window. The insurgents knew it. They'd been watching, waiting, studying patrol patterns for weeks. The attack was surgical in its brutality. RPGs hammered the lead and rear vehicles simultaneously, creating a kill box. Small arms fire erupted from positions carved into the canyon walls, angles so steep the Americans couldn't return effective fire without exposing themselves completely. Webb's voice over the radio was steady, but the words underneath carried weight. This wasn't a firefight. It was an execution waiting to happen. He called for immediate air support, any air support, knowing the Apache gunships were committed to another operation 40 miles north. Knowing the fast movers would take too long to spin up and reach them. Knowing that by the time help arrived, he'd be counting bodies instead of wounded. The Taliban fighters weren't firing wildly. They were conserving ammunition, taking measured shots, forcing the Americans to stay pinned while the heavy weapons teams repositioned. These weren't farmers with AKs. These were trained combatants executing a plan that had likely been rehearsed a dozen times. Webb had walked into a trap so carefully constructed it felt personal. What he didn't know, what nobody in that canyon knew, was that 70 miles away, an A-10 Thunderbolt II had just finished a show-of-force mission over a village where elders were meeting with coalition representatives. The pilot had been about to turn for home when the priority distress call cut through every other frequency. The voice that answered wasn't what Webb expected. It was calm, almost conversational, with a slight drawl that seemed completely disconnected from the urgency of the moment. The call sign was Reaper 72. The pilot was Captain Nadia Cowery, and her A-10 had enough ammunition for exactly one gun run before she'd need to return to base. She'd been in country for 6 months. Her squadron commander had explicitly told her to avoid taking unnecessary risks. Her fuel gauge was already in the yellow. None of that mattered when she heard the desperation buried beneath Webb's professional composure. She banked hard south, dropped to 500 feet, and pushed the throttles forward. The mountains ahead rose like ancient sentinels, their peaks disappearing into clouds that promised turbulence rough enough to shake fillings loose. Nadia had grown up in these kinds of valleys, not in Afghanistan, but in the canyon country of northern New Mexico, where her father had taught her to read terrain like a language. She knew what Webb was facing before he finished describing it. She also knew that flying an A-10 through a narrow canyon at combat speed was the kind of decision that ended careers or lives, sometimes both. Distance collapsed quickly. Nadia's weapons officer there wasn't one. The A-10 was single-seat, would have been running calculations, but she was already doing the math in her head. Fuel consumption at low altitude with full combat load. Time to target. Time on station. Ammunition expenditure versus target density. The numbers were unforgiving. She had one pass, maybe two if she pushed her luck and ignored every safety protocol written in blood by pilots who tried similar maneuvers and failed. The terrain was rising to meet her, ridgelines that seemed close enough to touch. Her altitude warning system was screaming, which meant she was doing it right. Flying low in an A-10 wasn't about bravery. It was about geometry and trust in the titanium bathtub surrounding her cockpit, trust in the aircraft's ability to absorb punishment that would shred anything else in the inventory. The Taliban had learned to respect the warthog. Some called it the Devil's Cross because of its profile. Others just called it death. Nadia checked her weapons panel. The GAU-8 Avenger rotary cannon was hot, 30mm rounds ready to fire at a rate that turned the aircraft into a platform for what was essentially a flying gun. She also had Maverick missiles, but those were for later if there was a later. Right now she needed eyes on the situation. Webb's voice came through again, tighter now, describing casualties. 2 dead, 5 wounded, and the enemy was maneuvering for a final assault. They had minutes, not hours. Nadia clicked her radio twice acknowledgement without words and dropped even lower. The canyon walls rose on either side, close enough that her wingtips seemed to brush the rock face. This was beyond standard tactics. This was barnstorming with a $30 million aircraft loaded with enough ordnance to level a city block. Her wingman, callsign Hammer 41, was 3 minutes behind her, too far back to help with the initial engagement. That was fine. She worked better alone anyway. The Taliban fighters hadn't seen her yet. They were focused on the kill, committed to the attack, certain that coalition air support was too far away to matter. That certainty was about to be corrected in the most violent way possible. Nadia armed her cannon and selected continuous fire mode. The targeting pipper on her heads-up display danced across the canyon walls as she searched for the weapons positions Webb had described. Then she saw them muzzle flashes like fireflies, 3 heavy machine gun nests carved into natural caves 30 feet up the cliff face. Perfect defensive positions, completely exposed from above. She rolled inverted for a split second to get a better angle, then pulled through, her airspeed kissing 300 knots in a space barely wide enough for a helicopter. This was where experience separated the living from the memorial plaques. She waited. Let the targeting solution develop. Let the distance collapse, then she squeezed the trigger. The sound of the GAU-8 is difficult to describe to anyone who hasn't heard it in combat. It's not a machine gun sound, not really. It's a roar, a deep sustained bellow that vibrates through the ground and into the chest cavity of anyone within a quarter mile. The rate of fire is so high that individual shots blend into a continuous tone, like tearing canvas the size of a football field. 65 rounds per second, each one the size of a milk bottle. Depleted uranium penetrators designed to punch through tank armor. Against human targets and defensive positions, the effect was biblical. Nadia's first burst lasted 2 seconds and expended 130 rounds. The rightmost machine gun position simply ceased to exist. The cave mouth transformed into a crater, rock and dust, and other things exploding outward in a cloud that hung in the canyon air. She adjusted her aim, walking the cannon fire along the cliff face with the precision of a surgeon and the destructive power of an artillery battery. The second position disappeared. The third tried to relocate, but it was too late. Her cannon rounds found them mid-movement. Webb's voice came through the radio, something between a laugh and a sob. Good hits, continue. But Nadia was already pulling up, the canyon walls screaming past as she climbed away from the valley floor. She needed altitude to assess and reposition. Her targeting Pachi didn't have one. The A-10 relied on visual acquisition, and the Mark I eyeball would have provided perfect battle damage assessment, but she could see well enough. 3 heavy weapons positions eliminated. But the ambush wasn't over. Taliban fighters were still firing from spider holes and concealed positions along the canyon floor, close enough to the American convoy that using her cannon risked friendly fire. She needed a different approach. That's when she saw the Technicolor Toyota pickup with a DSHK heavy machine gun mounted in the bed, positioned behind a rock outcropping that gave it a perfect angle on the immobilized convoy. The crew was good, disciplined, waiting for the air threat to pass before resuming fire. They didn't understand that Nadia wasn't leaving. She rolled into a steep bank, pulling GS that made her vision tunnel and brought her nose around for another pass. This time lower. This time personal. The technical crew saw her coming too late. They tried to swing the DSHK around, tried to acquire a firing solution on the diving aircraft. The A-10's armor could take hits from weapons that size, but Nadia didn't give them the chance. She fired a single Maverick missile from a range so close it barely had time to arm. The technical vanished in a fireball that sent shockwave ripples across the dust. The explosion was still echoing when Nadia turned her attention to the remaining fighters. They were breaking contact now, realizing that their carefully planned ambush had just been dismantled by a single aircraft. But running wasn't going to save them. Not today. She had fuel for maybe 5 more minutes on station, and she intended to use every second. Her cannon still had over 1,000 rounds remaining. That was enough. More than enough. She dropped back into the canyon, this time skimming so low that her landing gear almost kissed the riverbed that ran through the valley floor. It was insane flying, the kind of maneuver that training officers specifically warned against, the kind of thing that showed up in accident reports with phrases like pilot error and exceeded aircraft limitations. Except Nadia wasn't exceeding anything. She was operating exactly at the edge of what the A-10 could do, which was considerably beyond what most pilots ever discovered. The Taliban fighters were scattering now, abandoning their positions, running for the cave systems that honeycombed the northern ridge. Some of them almost made it. Nadia's next gun run caught them in the open, the 30mm round stitching a line of destruction across the hillside. Rock and earth erupted. When the dust settled, the movement had stopped. Webb's voice was clearer now, steadier. Reaper 7-2, enemy contact has ceased. We're moving wounded to casualty collection point. That was the finest display of close air support I've ever witnessed. Nadia didn't respond immediately. She was circling overhead, eyes scanning for any remaining threats, any movement that might indicate a secondary ambush or reinforcements. Her fuel gauge was screaming at her now, the low-level warning making its presence known. She had to leave. Had to return to base before she ended up gliding this $40 million piece of American engineering into a mountainside. But she waited anyway. Waited until she saw the convoy begin to move, the damaged vehicles being towed, the wounded being loaded into the remaining Humvees. Only then did she click her radio. Reaper 7-2 departing station. Hammer 4-1 is 2 minutes out. You're in good hands. Webb's response was quiet, almost personal. 7-2, I owe you a beer. Hell, I owe you a case. Tell you what, Nadia said, banking away from the valley and pointing her nose toward home. You get your people back safe, we'll call it even. The return flight gave her time to think, time to process what had just happened, time to realize that she'd done something either incredibly brave or incredibly stupid, and the difference between those two things was usually measured in inches and fractions of seconds. Back at Bagram, the landing was uneventful. The ground crew noticed the heat signatures on her cannon barrels, the residue of sustained fire. They noticed the nearly empty fuel tanks. They noticed the way Nadia climbed out of the cockpit moving like someone who just aged a decade in under an hour. Her squadron commander, Lieutenant Colonel Hayes, was waiting when she finished her post-flight inspection. He was a career officer, 22 years in, with a face that had forgotten how to smile somewhere over Baghdad in 2005. He looked at Nadia, looked at her aircraft, then looked at the mission report that had apparently already reached him through whatever mystical channels kept officers informed. "We need to talk," he said. It wasn't a request. They walked to his office in silence, Nadia still in her flight suit, sweat-stained and smelling of jet fuel and fear that she'd never admit to feeling. Hayes closed the door, gestured to a chair. She sat. He didn't. "You flew through the Korangal Canyon at 200 feet, Hayes said, actually below the rim line in some places according to Captain Webb's report, with a full combat load, in weather that grounded the Apache squadron. Yes, sir. You engaged targets from visual range at a distance that put you well within the envelope of small arms fire. Yes, sir. You expended approximately 300 rounds of 30mm ammunition and 1 Maverick missile. Yes, sir." Hayes was quiet for a moment, studying her with an expression that gave nothing away. Finally, he spoke. "Captain Webb estimates you saved 40 lives today, maybe more. The Taliban force was preparing for a final assault when you arrived." His exact words were, "Captain Cowery appeared from nowhere and proceeded to dismantle a prepared ambush with a level of precision and controlled aggression I've only seen in training videos." Nadia waited. There was more coming. There was always more. "That being said," Hayes continued, "you violated about a dozen safety protocols, exceeded minimum altitude requirements, and flew your aircraft into a tactical situation with insufficient fuel reserves for safe extraction. Any one of those things is a career-ending mistake. All three together should probably result in court-martial proceedings." He paused, looked at her directly. But they won't, because sometimes the book doesn't account for what actually happens in combat. Sometimes pilots have to make decisions that look insane on paper but are the only right choice in the moment. Today you made that choice. You saved American lives. That matters more than any regulation. Nadia nodded slowly. Thank you, sir. Don't thank me yet, Hayes said, because now everyone knows what you can do, and that means they're going to expect you to do it again. He was right, of course. Word spread through the base faster than official communications could travel. By evening, pilots from 3 different squadrons knew about the canyon run. By morning, it was base legend. By the end of the week, requests for Reaper 72 were being specifically submitted by ground commanders operating in the eastern provinces. Nadia's call sign took on weight, became something more than just a radio designation. It became a promise. A guarantee that if things went completely sideways, if the situation became hopeless, if the enemy thought they had won, there was a pilot who would fly through hell itself to prove them wrong. She didn't ask for the reputation, didn't particularly want it, but it followed her anyway, like a shadow that grew longer with each mission. 3 days after the Korangal incident, she got tasked with another close air support mission. Different valley, similar setup. Taliban fighters had ambushed a foot patrol and pinned them down in a village that intelligence had assessed as neutral territory. The patrol leader, a lieutenant named Morrison, sounded younger than he probably was, voice tight with stress as he described the situation over the radio. They were taking fire from 3 directions, casualties mounting. Medevac couldn't land until the area was secure. Nadia listened to the coordinates, plotted her approach, and felt that familiar tightness in her chest that wasn't quite fear but was definitely its close cousin. She'd gotten lucky in the Korangal, lucky that her timing was perfect, lucky that the terrain allowed for those impossible gun runs, lucky that no one on the ground had gotten a lucky shot through her canopy or into her engines. Luck wasn't infinite. Eventually it ran out. She pushed the thought away and focused on the mission. Morrison needed her to be precise. The enemy positions were close to the American patrol. Standard protocol called for danger-close warnings, for multiple confirmation steps before weapons release. But Morrison was losing people while she followed protocol. She arrived over the village at 6,000 feet, high enough to see the tactical picture. The patrol was holed up in a compound on the eastern edge, taking fire from buildings to the north, west, and south. Classic L-shaped ambush that had evolved into a killing box. The Taliban fighters were using civilian structures for cover, which meant collateral damage was a guarantee unless she was surgical. She checked her cannon ammunition, still over 1,000 rounds from the load after her last rearmament. Checked her Maverick inventory for missiles, though she'd need approval to use them this close to structures that might house non-combatants. Checked her fuel, always the fuel. She had time. Not much, but enough. Nadia descended, dropping her altitude until she was close enough to see muzzle flashes, close enough to distinguish between Taliban fighters and Morrison's patrol. The first gun run took out a heavy machine gun position in a 2-story building. She put a 3-second burst through the upper floor, precisely placed, watching the structure partially collapse. Morrison's voice. Confirmed hit, north position neutralized. But the fighters to the west had seen her now, were repositioning, trying to set up shots at the slow-moving A-10. They didn't understand that slow was relative. She banked hard, pulled through a turn that brought her nose around faster than seemed physically possible for an aircraft that heavy, and lined up on the western position. This time she used a Maverick, the missile streaking away and impacting with devastating accuracy. The building abandoned, she confirmed via her pre-mission intelligence brief ceased to be a tactical concern. 2 down, 1 to go. The southern position was the problem. Taliban fighters there had taken cover inside a mosque, firing from windows and doorways, using the structure's protected status as a shield. Morrison was explicitly forbidden from returning fire on the mosque. Rules of engagement were clear. Cultural sensitivity was paramount. People in Washington had made these rules, people who weren't currently bleeding out in an Afghan village while enemy combatants violated those same cultural norms they claimed to respect. Nadia circled, studying the situation, running calculations. She couldn't strike the mosque directly, but she could make the Taliban's position untenable. She dropped lower, came in from the south, and put a gun run into the street directly in front of the mosque entrance. The 30mm rounds tore up pavement, created a wall of dust and debris, cut off the fighter's line of sight to Morrison's position. Then she came around again, this time from the west, and repeated the performance. Another barrier, then from the north. By the time she'd finished, the Taliban fighters inside the mosque were effectively blind, cut off from their targets, unable to coordinate or maneuver. Morrison used the opportunity to extract his wounded and reposition to a more defensible location. The Taliban fighters, realizing their ambush had collapsed, abandoned the mosque and attempted to flee through the village's northern edge. That's when Nadia caught them in the open. The gun run was textbook controlled bursts, clear target identification, devastating effect. When it was over, Morrison's patrol was safe. Casualties were being loaded for medevac, and the village was secure. Morrison's after-action report called Reaper 72's intervention decisive and executed with exceptional precision under extremely challenging conditions. The official commendation mentioned distinguished service and exemplary courage. What it didn't mention was the weight that settled onto Nadia's shoulders a little heavier after each mission. The pattern repeated. Another week, another call for close air support. This time it was a special forces team conducting a raid on a compound suspected of housing high-value targets. The intelligence was good confirmed enemy presence, weapons cache, possible bomb-making materials. The plan was textbook fast insertion, overwhelming force, quick extraction. What intelligence hadn't mentioned was the platoon-strength Taliban element positioned in the hills overlooking the compound. The Special Forces team hit the compound right on schedule, breached the walls, cleared the first building, secured the courtyard. That's when the hillside came alive with machine gun fire. The team leader, callsign Viking 6, didn't panic. Special Forces operators don't panic. They assess, adapt, overcome. But even as he was organizing defensive positions, his voice carried an edge when he called for air support. Nadia was 15 minutes out when she caught the call. Her fuel load was better this time. She'd topped off before leaving base, had enough for maybe 25 minutes on station before she'd need to worry about getting home. Her wingman, Hammer 41 actually, a different pilot named Captain Marcus Chen, who'd been assigned to shadow her missions and learn her techniques, was flying formation 300 yards off her right wing. Chen was good, technically proficient by the book. He was also completely unprepared for what Nadia was about to do. She didn't explain her plan, didn't have time. She just rolled into a dive that took her from 6,000 feet to 500 feet in less than 10 seconds, pulled out so hard her G-suit activated and crushed the blood back toward her brain, and came screaming toward the hillside where the Taliban positions were dug in. Chen's voice crackled over the radio. 7-2, you're way too low, we need to coordinate, stay high. Nadia cut him off. Provide overwatch, I'm going in. She could imagine Chen's confusion, his training telling him this was wrong, that they should be working as a team, coordinating their attacks, following proper close air support doctrine. But doctrine was written for normal situations, and nothing about this was normal. The Taliban positions were reinforced fighting positions, probably constructed over weeks or months, with interlocking fields of fire and prepared escape routes. Taking them out would require precision. It would require getting close. Nadia brought her A-10 in so low that the turbulence from the hillside thermals made her instruments dance. She could see the machine gun nests now, could see the fighters scrambling to acquire her aircraft, could practically see the moment when they realized what was about to happen. She fired. The cannon roar echoed off the hills, a sound like the world ending. The first pass destroyed 2 positions. The second pass got 3 more. By the third pass, the Taliban fighters were abandoning their positions, running for the cave systems that honeycombed the hillside. But Nadia had studied the terrain maps before the mission. She knew where those caves led, knew where they'd emerge. She circled around, positioned herself at the northern cave entrance, and waited. When the fighters emerged, thinking they'd escaped, she was there. Viking 6's after-action report was 3 pages of detailed tactical analysis that basically boiled down to, Reaper 72 saved our lives, and I don't understand how she did it. Chen's report was more telling. He described watching Nadia fly her A-10 in ways he didn't think were possible, making decisions that seemed reckless until you saw the results, operating with a level of situational awareness that bordered on precognition. His final paragraph recommended that she be assigned to train other pilots in advanced close air support techniques. Hayes called her into his office again 2 days later. This time he wasn't alone. There was a colonel present, someone from CENTCOM headquarters with ribbons that suggested he'd seen combat in 3 different decades. The colonel introduced himself as Stevens, didn't offer a first name. "Captain Cowery," Stevens said, "your reputation is starting to cause problems." Nadia kept her expression neutral. "Sir, you're being specifically requested by ground commanders," Stevens continued, "to the point where some units are delaying operations if you're not available. That's unsustainable from an operational standpoint. It also places an unfair burden on you and creates expectations that no single pilot can consistently meet." He paused. "That being said, your effectiveness is undeniable. In the past 2 weeks, you've been credited with saving over 80 coalition lives through close air support missions that most pilots wouldn't attempt. Your weapons employment has been precise enough to minimize collateral damage while maximizing tactical effect. And somehow you've managed to do all this while maintaining your aircraft and not getting yourself killed, which frankly surprises me." Hayes spoke up. "Colonel Stevens is here to discuss a training initiative. We want to create a program that teaches other A-10 pilots your techniques. We want to understand how you assess situations, how you make decisions, how you fly in environments that standard doctrine says are too dangerous." Nadia felt something cold settle in her stomach. "You want me to teach other pilots to take the risks I take?" "We want you to teach them to think the way you think," Stevens corrected. "The risks are secondary. What matters is the decision-making process. The situational awareness, the ability to read terrain and tactical situations in real time and adapt accordingly." They were asking her to systematize something that didn't feel systematic, to explain instincts that she developed through thousands of hours of flying, through growing up in canyon country, through her father's lessons about reading landscapes and understanding spaces. How do you teach someone to feel the way air moves around mountains? How do you explain the split-second calculation that tells you whether a gap is wide enough, whether an angle is too steep, whether the risk is worth the outcome? But she agreed anyway, because she understood what they were really asking. They were asking her to multiply her effectiveness, to create more pilots who could do what she did, so the burden didn't rest entirely on her shoulders, so that when the next Captain Webb radioed for help, there would be more than one pilot willing to fly through impossible terrain to save him. The training program started 3 weeks later. 6 pilots, all experienced A-10 flyers, all volunteers. They met in a classroom that smelled of stale coffee and jet fuel, and Nadia stood at the front feeling deeply uncomfortable with the role she'd been assigned. She was 28 years old. Some of these pilots had more combat hours than she had total flight time. They were looking at her expecting wisdom, expecting revelations, expecting her to unlock some secret that would transform them into legends. Instead, she told them the truth. "I'm not teaching you to fly the way I fly," she said. "I'm teaching you to think about the mission differently, to understand that the book is a starting point, not a limitation, to trust your aircraft and trust yourself enough to push boundaries when the situation demands it." One of the pilots, a major named Richards who had a reputation for being a stickler for regulations, raised his hand. "With respect, Captain, what you're describing sounds like an invitation to get people killed. There are rules for minimum altitudes and safe separation distances for a reason." Nadia nodded. "You're absolutely right. Those rules exist because pilots died figuring out where the limits are. I'm not asking you to ignore those rules. I'm asking you to understand them well enough to know when breaking them is the only option that doesn't result in dead Americans on the ground." Richards didn't look convinced, but he didn't argue further. The training continued for 6 weeks. They flew simulations, studied terrain maps, reviewed gun camera footage from Nadia's missions. She walked them through her decision-making process, explained how she assessed risk versus reward, demonstrated techniques for low-altitude flying in mountainous terrain. Some of it was teachable, some of it wasn't. By the end of the program, 3 of the 6 pilots had internalized enough of the concepts to apply them effectively. 2 were solid but would never push boundaries the way Nadia did. Richards remained skeptical, but admitted that understanding the theoretical framework was valuable even if he never intended to apply it practically. The real test came 5 weeks after the training program concluded. A Marine unit was pinned down in the Sangin district, taking casualties from a well-coordinated Taliban assault. The call for air support went out, and 2 aircraft responded. One was Nadia. The other was Captain Alina Reeves, one of the pilots from the training program. They arrived over the battlefield within minutes of each other. The Marines were in desperate shape, surrounded on 3 sides, running low on ammunition, medevac unable to land because of the heavy fire. The Taliban had learned from previous engagements. They'd positioned themselves in ways that made standard attack runs difficult, mixing their positions with civilian structures, creating situations that required precision beyond what most pilots could deliver. Nadia took the northern positions. Reeves took the south. For the next 15 minutes, they worked in perfect coordination, not because they were communicating constantly, but because they'd both learned to read the battlefield the same way. Reeves executed a gun run at 300 feet, threading her aircraft between 2 ridgelines with less than 50 yards of clearance on either side. It was textbook Nadia cavalry flying, performed by someone who'd learned not just the techniques but the mindset. When the smoke cleared, the Marines were able to extract 0 additional casualties during the engagement. The Marine commander's report specifically mentioned both pilots by name and requested they be assigned to future operations in the district. Hayes showed Nadia the report during their weekly briefing. "Reeves credits you with saving her life twice during training," he said. "Once when you explained terrain masking in mountainous environments, and once when you convinced her that trusting her instincts was as important as following the checklist." Nadia remembered both conversations, remembered Reeves, who'd been quiet during most of the training, suddenly coming alive when they'd discussed reading terrain, remembered the moment when something had clicked, when theory had transformed into understanding. "She was a good student," Nadia said. Hayes smiled, which was rare enough to be noteworthy. "You're a good teacher, which is why CENTCOM wants to expand the program. Bring in pilots from other squadrons, maybe even other airframes. They want to create a doctrine around adaptive close air support, and they want you at the center of it." It should have felt like recognition, like validation. Instead, it felt like momentum, like a wave building that she couldn't control or direct. Her life was becoming something she didn't quite recognize, less about flying and more about being a symbol, a standard, a name that meant something to people she'd never met. But the missions continued. That was the constant. No matter what else happened, there were always Americans on the ground who needed help, always Taliban fighters who thought they had the advantage, always situations that required someone to fly an A-10 into places that seemed impossible. 6 months into her deployment, Nadia had flown 83 combat missions. She'd expended enough ammunition to fill a small warehouse. She'd been credited with saving over 200 coalition lives. She'd been awarded a Distinguished Flying Cross and an Air Medal with Valor device. She'd also stopped sleeping well. The dreams came irregularly but with increasing intensity. She'd be back in the Korangal Canyon, but this time her cannon wouldn't fire. Or she'd be over the village helping Morrison's patrol, but her missiles would miss. Or she'd be flying through terrain that shifted and moved, mountains that grew taller as she approached, gaps that narrowed until her wings scraped rock. She'd wake up with her heart hammering, sweat-soaked, checking her watch to see how long until she had to be at the flight line. Her roommate, a logistics officer named Captain Park, noticed but had the grace not to comment. The unofficial support system on base, the other pilots, the crew chiefs, the intelligence officers who'd worked with her enough to understand what she was carrying provided what help they could. Hayes started scheduling her lighter weeks after particularly intense missions. Chen, who'd become something like a friend despite their different approaches to flying, made sure she showed up for meals. But the weight kept accumulating. It wasn't just the combat. It was the knowledge that people were counting on her specifically, that her name had become synonymous with impossible rescues, that every time she took a day off or rotated out for mandatory rest, there might be someone who died because she wasn't there. The rational part of her brain knew that was unsustainable thinking. Knew that she couldn't save everyone, that other pilots were competent and capable, that the system didn't revolve around one person. The other part of her brain, the part that heard Morrison's voice tight with fear, that remembered Webb's gratitude, that had seen the faces of Marines who'd been certain they were going to die until an A-10 appeared overhead, didn't care about rationality. On the 200th day of her deployment, she got a call that changed everything. Not a combat call, a personal one. Her father had died. Heart attack, sudden, probably didn't feel anything. The notification came through official channels, Red Cross message, commander's notification, the whole formal apparatus that the military had developed for delivering the worst news possible with maximum dignity and minimum comfort. Hayes found her in the ready room, staring at the notification like it was written in a language she didn't quite understand. He didn't say anything at first, just sat down next to her and waited. Finally, Nadia spoke. "I need to go home." "I know," Hayes said. "Emergency leave is already approved. There's a transport leaving for Germany in 3 hours. You'll be stateside tomorrow." She nodded, started to stand. Hayes put a hand on her shoulder. "Nadia, take the time you need. Don't rush back. We'll manage." She wanted to believe him, wanted to trust that the system would continue functioning without her, that other pilots would cover the missions, that the ground forces would be fine. But she'd seen the request sheets, seen the specific calls for Reaper 72, seen the way some commanders would delay operations if she wasn't available. "I'll be back in 2 weeks," she said. Hayes looked like he wanted to argue but didn't. 2 weeks. Take care of yourself, Captain." The funeral was in Albuquerque, in the small cemetery where her mother was buried, where generations of cowries had been laid to rest since her great-grandfather had immigrated from Lebanon in the 1920s. The service was simple family, close friends, her father's co-workers from the surveying company where he'd worked for 30 years. Nadia wore her dress blues, which felt both appropriate and completely wrong. Her father had been proud when she'd joined the Air Force, proud when she'd made pilot, proud when she'd been selected for the A-10. But he'd also worried, had understood in the way that only someone who truly knew her could, that she had a tendency to carry the world on her shoulders until it crushed her. After the service, her uncle, her father's younger brother, pulled her aside. "Your father talked about you constantly," he said. "About your flying, about your missions. He kept newspaper clippings about the A-10, watched documentaries about close air support, tried to understand what you were doing over there." Nadia felt something crack inside her chest. "He never mentioned that when we talked. He didn't want to pressure you," her uncle said. "But he was worried, Nadia, worried that you were taking on too much, trying to save everyone. He recognized that in you because he'd done the same thing when he was younger. Worked himself into exhaustion trying to provide for the family after your mother died. He didn't want you to make the same mistakes." The 2 weeks of leave passed in a blur. She settled her father's estate, which wasn't complicated. He'd been a methodical man, had everything organized and documented. She visited the canyon country where he'd taught her to read terrain, stood on the same ridges where they'd watched hawks ride thermals, and discussed the way air moved around obstacles. On the last day before her flight back to Afghanistan, she drove out to the Rio Grande Gorge. It was early morning, the light just starting to touch the canyon rim, painting the rock faces in shades of red and gold. She stood at the edge and thought about her father, about the missions, about the weight she'd been carrying. She thought about Webb's convoy, about Morrison's patrol, about every American who'd radioed for help while bullets snapped overhead and the world tried to kill them. She thought about her father's warning about trying to save everyone, and then she made a decision. When she returned to Afghanistan, she would keep flying, would keep responding to calls for air support, would keep putting her aircraft into situations that made safety officers nervous and other pilots shake their heads. But she would also acknowledge what her father had understood, that she couldn't save everyone, that some situations were beyond even her ability to fix, that there was a difference between being dedicated and being self-destructive. The realization didn't make the weight lighter, but it made it more bearable. She returned to Bagram on a gray afternoon, the mountains around the base shrouded in clouds that promised snow at the higher elevations. Hayes met her at the terminal, which was unusual enough that she knew something had happened. "There's a situation developing," he said without preamble. "Army unit conducting a clearing operation in the Kunar province. Intelligence suggested light resistance. Intelligence was wrong. They've been in sustained contact for 6 hours. Multiple casualties. Medevac is being suppressed by heavy weapons fire. 3 previous air support attempts were driven off by concentrated anti-aircraft fire." Nadia felt the old familiar tightness in her chest, the pre-mission focus that pushed everything else aside. "They're asking for me specifically." It wasn't a question. Hayes nodded. "Ground commander is a captain named Rodriguez. He was at Sangin last year, remembers what you did for the Marine unit. He's requesting Reaper 72 by name." She should have felt something about that, pride maybe, or satisfaction. Instead, she just felt tired. And then she felt the weight settle back onto her shoulders, familiar and heavy and inescapable. "How long until I can be airborne? Your aircraft is pre-flighted and armed. You can be wheels up in 15 minutes. Nadia didn't bother going to her quarters. She headed straight for the flight line, where her A-10 battered, patched, bearing scars from a dozen engagements waited like an old friend. The crew chief, a master sergeant named Diaz who'd been maintaining her aircraft for 5 months, had the canopy already open. "Good to have you back, Captain," Diaz said, "though I was hoping you'd take more time." "So was I," Nadia admitted. She climbed into the cockpit, began her pre-flight checks with the automatic efficiency of long practice. The flight to Kunar province took 40 minutes. Rodriguez's voice on the radio was professional but strained. He'd been in command while his unit was systematically chewed apart by an enemy force that was larger, better positioned, and more motivated than intelligence had predicted. He needed help, and he needed it from someone who could operate in an environment where 3 other pilots had already tried and failed. The anti-aircraft threat was the problem. Taliban fighters had brought in heavy machine guns, possibly even man-portable surface-to-air missiles, and positioned them in a way that created overlapping coverage of the battlefield. Standard close air support tactics required altitude for safety, but altitude meant reduced accuracy, which meant higher risk of friendly fire casualties given how close the 2 forces were engaged. Nadia studied the tactical situation as she approached. The army unit was pinned in a valley. Of course it was a valley. It was always a valley with high ground on 3 sides. The Taliban had fighters positioned in the heights, raining down fire while staying protected from return fire. The previous air support attempts had all followed standard doctrine: stay high, use precision weapons, minimize exposure. All had been driven off by anti-aircraft fire before they could make effective attacks. Nadia was going to do the opposite. She dropped to low altitude before she even reached the valley, using terrain masking to hide her approach. Then she came in from an unexpected angle, from the east, through a narrow side canyon that was barely wide enough for her wingspan, below the ridgeline where the anti-aircraft weapons were positioned. The Taliban fighters probably never saw her until she was already firing. Her first gun run took out 2 heavy weapons positions. By the time the anti-aircraft crews realized she was below them instead of above them, she was already cycling for another pass. The trick was speed and unpredictability, never coming from the same angle twice, never staying in one flight pattern long enough for the enemy to anticipate, using the terrain, the ridges, the draws, the rock outcroppings, to mask her movements between attacks. It was dangerous. It was exhausting. It was exactly what the situation required. For 20 minutes, Nadia turned that valley into her personal engagement zone. She eliminated 7 heavy weapons positions, destroyed 3 technical vehicles, and suppressed enough of the Taliban force that Rodriguez was able to reposition his unit and create a defensible perimeter. The medevac was able to land. The wounded were extracted. By the time she climbed back to altitude and headed for home, her fuel was critically low and her ammunition was almost expended. But Rodriguez's people were alive. The after-action report called it a masterclass in aggressive close air support conducted under highly dangerous conditions. CENTCOM mentioned it as an example of exceptional airmanship and tactical decision-making. The Air Force Times ran an article about it, though they didn't use her name. Operational security concerns. But within the military aviation community, everyone knew Reaper 72 had done it again. That should have been the pinnacle. The moment where everything came together, where all the training and instinct and experience crystallized into perfect execution. Instead, Nadia felt hollow. She'd saved Rodriguez's unit, but 3 soldiers had died before she arrived. 3 more were critically wounded despite her intervention. The tactical victory was real, but it came with a butcher's bill that kept her awake that night, staring at the ceiling of her quarters, counting casualties instead of sheep. The deployment was winding down. She had 5 weeks left before her rotation ended and she returned stateside. 5 weeks to either solidify her legend or make the mistake that killed her. The missions kept coming. A special operations team needed extraction under fire. She provided cover while they reached their helicopter. A forward operating base was being probed by Taliban scouts. She ran a show-of-force mission that convinced them to find easier targets. A convoy hit an IED and needed air cover during recovery operations. She orbited overhead for 2 hours, a visible deterrent against anyone thinking about a follow-up attack. Each mission was successful. Each one added to the reputation. And each one took something from her that she couldn't quite name. Chen noticed. During a rare evening when they were both off duty, he found her in the gym, running on a treadmill like she was trying to outpace something invisible. "You need to talk to someone," he said. "I talk to lots of people," Nadia replied, not breaking stride. "I mean professionally. There's a counselor on base. She specializes in combat stress." Nadia laughed, which came out bitter. "I'm fine." "You're not fine. None of us are fine, but you're especially not fine and everyone can see it except you." She didn't respond, just kept running. Chen watched her for a moment, then sighed. "Your father died 2 weeks ago. You came back early. You've flown 8 missions since returning. You're averaging 4 hours of sleep a night. That's not fine, Nadia. That's textbook burnout with a side order of unprocessed grief." He was right. She knew he was right. But acknowledging it felt like weakness, like admitting she couldn't handle the job, couldn't carry the weight that everyone else seemed to think she was built to carry. She finally stopped running, stood on the stationary treadmill breathing hard. "If I talk to someone, if I admit I'm struggling, they might ground me. And if they ground me, people die. That's not dramatic, Chen. That's math. We both know there are commanders who specifically request me because they trust me to get their people home alive. What happens to those people if I'm sitting in therapy sessions instead of in my cockpit?" Chen's expression was sympathetic but firm. "What happens when you finally break? When you're so exhausted or emotionally compromised that you make a mistake? When you misjudge a distance or miss a threat or freeze at exactly the wrong moment? You think that helps anyone?" The argument was logical, rational, completely correct. She hated it, but she also couldn't refute it. The next day, she made an appointment with the counselor, a major named Dr. Simmons who had the tired eyes of someone who'd heard too many combat stories and the gentle manner of someone who genuinely wanted to help. Their first session was awkward. Nadia wasn't good at talking about feelings, about acknowledging vulnerability, about admitting that the weight was becoming too much. She talked around the issue, gave surface-level answers, kept her defenses up. Dr. Simmons let her. Didn't push, didn't pry, just listened and asked occasional questions that Nadia could choose to answer or deflect. By the third session, something had shifted. Nadia found herself actually talking about her father, about the missions, about the growing sense that she was being slowly crushed under expectations that no single person should have to meet. "You've created a persona," Dr. Simmons said. "Reaper 72. The pilot who always comes through, who never fails, who can accomplish the impossible. That persona serves a purpose. It gives ground forces confidence. It provides a psychological edge, but it's not sustainable because you're not a persona, you're a person, and people have limits. So what do I do? Nadia asked. I can't just stop being what people need me to be. You don't have to stop, but you do have to establish boundaries. Accept that you can't save everyone. Acknowledge that sometimes the situation is impossible no matter how skilled you are. Give yourself permission to be human. It sounded simple. It was anything but. Establishing boundaries meant saying no to mission requests, meant accepting that sometimes another pilot would respond to a call instead of her, even if she was available, meant trusting that the system could function without her being the solution to every problem. Over the next 2 weeks, she tried. Small steps. When a routine patrol requested air cover, and she'd already flown 2 missions that day, she let another pilot take it instead of volunteering. When a special operations team asked for her specifically for a mission that wasn't scheduled for 3 days, she didn't clear her schedule to accommodate them. She let them work with whoever was available in the rotation. It felt wrong. Felt like abandoning people, like failing to meet the standard she'd set for herself. But nothing catastrophic happened. The patrol completed their mission without incident. The Special Operations Team successfully extracted their target with a different pilot providing air support. The world continued turning without Reaper 72 being the axis it rotated around. Hayes noticed the change, mentioned it during one of their regular briefings. "You seem different," he said. "More centered, maybe. Less like you're carrying the weight of the entire theater on your shoulders." "Trying to be," Nadia admitted. "Trying to remember that I'm one pilot in one squadron, not the Air Force's answer to every problem." Hayes smiled. "That's healthy, also somewhat ironic given that I just received orders from CENTCOM about you." Nadia felt her stomach tight. "What orders?" "You're being pulled early, 2 weeks ahead of your scheduled rotation. They want you stateside to help develop the expanded training program we discussed. You'll be assigned to Nelly's, working with the weapons school to create a formal curriculum for advanced close air support." It should have felt like an escape, a chance to step away from combat, to stop carrying the weight, to focus on teaching instead of fighting. But it also felt like abandonment, like leaving before the job was done. "There are units here that depend on me," she said. "There are units everywhere that depend on competent close air support," Hayes countered. "Right now, you're one pilot. If we can turn your techniques into doctrine, into something we can teach to 100 pilots, 1,000 pilots, then we multiply your effectiveness exponentially. You save more lives by teaching than you ever could by flying." The logic was sound, but logic didn't erase the feeling that she was running away. Her final 2 weeks in Afghanistan were surreal. She flew 4 more missions, all successful, all adding to a legacy that felt increasingly disconnected from who she actually was. Other pilots threw her a going-away party that was equal parts respect and relief. Respect for what she'd accomplished. Relief that someone else would now be the go-to pilot for impossible situations. Rodriguez, the army captain she'd saved in Kunar province, sent a message through official channels thanking her and requesting her mailing address so his unit could send something. Webb, from that first mission in the Korangal Canyon, did the same. On her last night in Afghanistan, Nadia stood outside the operations center and looked up at the stars. They were brilliant in the thin mountain air, uncountable points of light scattered across a darkness that seemed infinite. She thought about her father, about the lessons he'd taught her in the canyons of New Mexico, about reading terrain and understanding spaces, about knowing when to push forward and when to acknowledge limits, about the difference between bravery and stubbornness. She thought about Webb and Rodriguez and Morrison, and all the other names she'd learned over 6 months of combat, about the lives saved and the weight carried, and the impossible expectations that she'd somehow managed to meet more often than not. And she thought about going home, about trading the cockpit for a classroom, about teaching other pilots to think the way she thought, to fly the way she flew, to push boundaries while respecting the laws of physics and the limitations of human endurance. The transport flight to Germany was uneventful. Then a commercial flight to the States, civilian clothes, a world that seemed too loud and too bright and too disconnected from the place she'd just left. Her new assignment at Nellis Air Force Base in Nevada came with quarters, an office, and a mandate to develop a training program that would fundamentally change how the Air Force approached close air support in complex terrain. The work was difficult in entirely different ways than combat had been. Creating curriculum meant understanding not just what she did, but why she did it, breaking down instinct into teachable components, finding ways to transfer knowledge that lived in her bones into lesson plans that others could follow. She worked with experienced instructors, with pilots who'd been flying the A-10 since before she was born, with tactical experts who understood combat theory, but sometimes struggled to bridge the gap between theory and application. The program they built was comprehensive 60 days of intensive training covering terrain masking, low-altitude flying techniques, threat assessment, weapons employment in danger-close situations, and the mental frameworks for making split-second decisions when lives hung in the balance. The first class started 6 months after she arrived at Nellis. 12 pilots, all volunteers, all with combat experience, all looking at Nadia like she held secrets they desperately needed to learn. She stood in front of them on the first day and felt an echo of that discomfort she'd experienced when she'd first started teaching at Bagram. "I'm not going to teach you to be me," she said. "I'm going to teach you to be the best version of yourself, to understand your aircraft's capabilities and your own limitations well enough that, when the situation demands something extraordinary, you'll know whether it's possible or suicidal." One of the pilots, a captain named Tors with 3 deployments under his belt, raised his hand. "What's the difference?" Nadia smiled. It was a good question. "The difference is judgment, understanding that extraordinary doesn't mean reckless, that pushing boundaries requires knowing exactly where those boundaries are. I've survived because I'm not actually taking the insane risks that people think I am. I'm taking calculated risks based on thousands of hours of experience and a very accurate understanding of what my aircraft can handle. What looks like magic is actually just math and muscle memory." Over the next 60 days, she proved it. They flew simulations that pushed the limits of what seemed possible, practiced low-altitude maneuvers in mountainous terrain until they became reflexive, studied gun camera footage from dozens of engagements, analyzed decisions, discussed alternatives. And something remarkable happened. The pilots got better, not just technically proficient but genuinely capable of the kind of adaptive, aggressive flying that Nadia had become known for. Tors, it turned out, had instincts that were almost as good as hers once he learned to trust them. Another pilot, Major Lisa Kwan, demonstrated an ability to read terrain that was exceptional even by the standards of the program. By graduation, all 12 pilots had proven they could operate in environments that would have been considered too dangerous using standard doctrine. The program was declared a success. More classes were scheduled. Pilots from other bases requested slots. The curriculum was refined, expanded, incorporated into the formal weapons school training pipeline. Nadia's techniques, once unique, became doctrine. Her flights, once legendary, became teachable. And somehow, improbably, that felt like a bigger victory than any single combat mission. 2 years after leaving Afghanistan, she got a letter from Webb. He was back stateside now, assigned to a training unit at Fort Benning, teaching the next generation of officers how to call for close air support. His letter was simple. "Captain Cowery, I wanted you to know that my son was born last month. Named him after you, well, the male version. Nader Webb. My wife thinks I'm crazy, but I explained that he wouldn't exist if you hadn't flown through that canyon 2 years ago. Thought you should know that. You don't just save lives in the moment. You save all the moments that come after, all the birthdays and graduations and weddings and grandchildren. You saved a future that won't know your name but exists because of your courage. Thank you, Captain Marcus Webb." Nadia read the letter 3 times, then carefully filed it away with a handful of other personal correspondence she'd received from people she'd helped during her deployment. She didn't think of herself as sentimental, but these letters mattered. They were evidence that the weight had been worth carrying. 3 years after leaving Afghanistan, she was promoted to major. The promotion came with a new assignment commander of an A-10 squadron scheduled for deployment to Eastern Europe as part of NATO operations. It was, in many ways, a return to operational flying, but with a difference. This time she wasn't a lone pilot taking impossible missions. She was a commander responsible for 20 aircraft and 50 pilots, her job to ensure they were trained, equipped, and ready for whatever the mission demanded. She applied the lessons she'd learned about boundaries and limits and the difference between dedication and self-destruction, about multiplying effectiveness through teaching rather than trying to be everywhere at once, about trusting other people to carry part of the weight. Her squadron developed a reputation for excellence. They weren't flashy, didn't have the dramatic rescue stories that had defined her time in Afghanistan, but they were consistently effective, consistently professional, consistently ready. The pilots called themselves Reaper Squadron as a nod to her old call sign, which made her simultaneously proud and uncomfortable. 5 years after the Korangal Canyon, she was attending a conference on close air support doctrine when she ran into Rodriguez. He was a major now, assigned to an operations planning staff, looking older but healthier than he'd sounded over the radio that day in Kunar province. They talked for an hour, comparing notes on how the war had changed, how tactics had evolved, how the lessons learned in blood were being systematically incorporated into training and doctrine. "You changed the way we think about air support," Rodriguez said. "Before you, it was this thing we requested and hoped would show up eventually. After you, after what you did for my unit and a dozen others, ground commanders started understanding that air support could be immediate, precise, and aggressive. That changed everything." Nadia deflected the praise, as she always did, but privately she acknowledged the truth in his words. The program at Nelly's had graduated over 100 pilots. Those pilots had deployed to conflicts around the world, had saved countless lives using techniques that had once been unique to her. The math that Dr. Simmons had talked about multiplying effectiveness through teaching had proven itself exponentially. 7 years after leaving Afghanistan, Nadia was promoted to lieutenant colonel and assigned to the Pentagon, working on aircraft procurement and tactical doctrine development. It was the kind of career progression that meant success in military terms: more responsibility, more influence, more impact on how the Air Force operated. It also meant less flying. Her last operational flight had been 6 months earlier, a training mission with her squadron before she transferred to Washington. She missed it, missed the feel of the A-10, the satisfaction of a perfect gun run, the clarity that came from having a specific mission and the tools to accomplish it. But she also understood that this was part of the natural progression. She'd been the pilot, then the teacher, now the policymaker, each role built on the previous one, expanding her impact while moving her further from the cockpit. She made peace with it, mostly. 10 years after the Korangal Canyon mission, the Air Force created an award for exceptional close air support in combat. They named it the Cowery Medal. Nadia learned about it through official channels, a memorandum announcing the new award, describing its criteria, noting that it would be presented to pilots who demonstrated extraordinary courage, exceptional skill, and unwavering dedication to supporting ground forces in contact with the enemy. Her father would have been proud. The thought came unbidden and brought with it a familiar ache. He'd never known about most of her missions, had died before the legend of Reaper 72 had fully formed, but she thought he would have understood what she'd been trying to do, would have recognized the same drive to help people that he'd demonstrated in his own quieter way. The first Cowery Medal was awarded to Captain Torres, who'd gone on to have an exceptional career and had recently saved an entire company pinned down by ISIS fighters in Syria. Nadia attended the ceremony, watched as Torres received the medal, listened as the citation was read describing actions that sounded hauntingly familiar. After the ceremony, Torres found her. "This feels wrong," he said, holding the medal. "You should be getting this, not me." "You earned it," Nadia said simply. "That's all that matters. I earned it using techniques you taught me, following an example you set, standing on shoulders you built." He paused. "But I want you to know I understand the weight now. Understand what you carried for all those months in Afghanistan. The expectations, the requests, the feeling that you can't ever fail because lives depend on you not failing. It's crushing if you let it be. So don't let it be, Nadia said. Set boundaries, trust your fellow pilots. Remember that you're part of a team, not a lone operator. I learned that too late. You can learn it earlier. Torres nodded slowly. Did it get easier, the weight, I mean? No, Nadia admitted. But you get stronger at carrying it, and you learn to share the load. 15 years after the Coringal Canyon, Nadia was a colonel commanding an entire wing. 20 years after, she was a brigadier general working at Air Combat Command. She'd risen about as far as an officer could rise while staying connected to operational flying and tactical development. Her hair showed gray at the temples. Her dress uniform carried ribbons that told a story of combat, command, and consequence. Young pilots looked at her with a mixture of respect and disbelief. It was difficult for them to reconcile the general officer with the legends they'd heard about Reaper 72. But occasionally, very occasionally, she'd take a seat in an A-10 cockpit and fly. Not combat missions. Those days were long past. Just training flights, familiarization sorties, chances to remember what it felt like to strap a 30mm cannon to her chest and turn the sky into her personal workspace. On one of those flights, cruising through the desert southwest at low altitude, she found herself over familiar terrain. The Rio Grande Gorge, the canyons where her father had taught her to read landscapes. She dropped lower, following the river's course, threading through gaps between cliff faces, feeling the aircraft respond to her inputs with the easy familiarity of an old friend. And for a few minutes, she wasn't a general officer with responsibilities stretching across continents. She was just a pilot, flying through beautiful country, understanding in her bones the relationship between air and rock and distance. She thought about that day in the Coringal Canyon, the decision to drop below the rim line, to commit to a course of action that was either brilliant or suicidal depending on how the next 30 seconds unfolded. She thought about Webb's voice on the radio, Morrison's gratitude, Rodriguez's desperation. She thought about all the pilots she'd trained, all the missions flown by people applying techniques she'd helped develop, all the lives saved by a multiplication of effectiveness that started with one pilot willing to push boundaries. The weight was still there, would always be there, but it felt different now, not lighter, but distributed, shared across thousands of pilots and decades of doctrine, and a legacy that had grown far beyond one person's combat deployment. She climbed back to altitude, pointed her nose toward home, and felt something she hadn't experienced in years. Peace. Not the peace of completion. There was always more work to do, always more pilots to train, always more lives hanging in the balance somewhere. But the peace of knowing she'd done what she could, had pushed as hard as was reasonable, had carried the weight until she'd learned to share it, had turned personal excellence into institutional capability. The sun was setting as she returned to base, painting the desert in shades of red and gold that reminded her of Afghanistan, of early mornings launching for missions, of late evenings returning with empty ammunition bins and full hearts. She landed smoothly, taxied to the flight line, shut down the engines. The crew chief, young, probably in his early 20s, gave her a thumbs up. "Good flight, General." "Perfect flight," Nadia confirmed. That night she sat at her desk reviewing the latest tactical reports from deployed A-10 squadrons. Pilots were successfully executing complex close air support missions in challenging terrain. Casualties were being prevented. Lives were being saved. The work was continuing, the legacy expanding, the mission ongoing. She pulled out the old letter from Webb, the one about his son. It had been years since she'd looked at it, but the words still resonated. You don't just save lives in the moment. You save all the moments that come after. Nader Webb would be over 20 now. Probably in college, maybe dadding, certainly with no memory of the day his father almost died in an Afghan valley. But he existed. He and thousands of other children of soldiers who'd been saved, futures that had been preserved, moments that continued to unfold because someone had flown an A-10 through a canyon at an altitude that seemed impossible. The weight wasn't heavy anymore. It was just part of who she was. Part of the legacy she'd built. Part of the contribution she'd made to something larger than herself. General Nadia Cowdery, formerly Captain Cowdery, formerly Reaper 72, closed her eyes and remembered the roar of the GAU-8 cannon, the feel of the stick in her hand, the absolute certainty that came from knowing you were in the right place at the right time doing exactly what you were meant to do. She'd been lucky. Lucky to have the skills, the training, the aircraft, and the opportunities to make a difference. Lucky to have learned about boundaries before the weight crushed her. Lucky to have had teachers and commanders and fellow pilots who understood what she was carrying and helped distribute the load. But luck wasn't the whole story. There had been choices. The choice to fly through that canyon when everyone else would have stayed high. The choice to keep volunteering for missions when she could have taken easier assignments. The choice to share what she knew instead of hoarding techniques as personal secrets. The choice to acknowledge her limits before they destroyed her. The choice to build something lasting instead of burning bright and flaming out. Those choices had created a career, a legacy, a fundamental shift in how the Air Force thought about close air support. But more importantly, they'd created a multiplication effect. One pilot's excellence transformed into hundreds of pilots' capability, transforming individual heroism into institutional competence. That was the real victory, not the dramatic rescues or the combat medals or the legends told in ready rooms. The real victory was the young pilot who would never know her name, flying a mission somewhere in the world, using techniques she'd helped develop to save Americans under fire. Firefight that would be won because doctrine had changed. The casualties prevented because training had improved. The lives saved in quiet moments that would never make headlines or generate after-action reports. She thought about her father one last time, wondered what he'd make of everything she'd accomplished, everything she'd become. Decided he'd probably just be relieved she'd figured out the lesson he'd tried to teach her, that strength wasn't about carrying everything alone. It was about knowing when to share the load. The stars were visible through her office window, brilliant points of light in the darkness. The same stars that had shone over Afghanistan, over New Mexico, over every place she'd ever been. Constant, unchanging. A reminder that the universe was vast and indifferent and beautiful. Nadia stood, stretched, and headed home. Tomorrow there would be more work. More pilots to train, more doctrine to develop, more lives to save through the multiplication of effectiveness that teaching created. But tonight she was just tired. Tired and content and at peace with the weight she'd carried and the legacy she'd built. Reaper 72 had become a legend. But General Nadia Cowrie had become something more important. A teacher, a leader, and a reminder that individual excellence meant nothing if it couldn't be shared, taught, and multiplied into something that outlasted any single person's career. The canyon was behind her now. But the sky stretched forward, infinite and full of possibility. And somewhere out there, a pilot she'd never meet was about to make a decision that would save lives using techniques she'd helped develop. That was enough. That was more than enough. That was everything.